Right, so by now you should have a decent idea of what constraints are and how they are used to forge relations between the different views. In this lesson, we will use most of the concepts learnt in previous videos to build a more complex design. This time we will introduce another level to the app view hierarchy. And so our app, which we will call CareerMate, looks something like this. We have the superview. On top of the superview, we have 4 subviews placed side by side, totally covering the superview. And each of these subviews will have an image of a career choice as well as the name of the career. The idea is for the user to click on a career to know more. By building this app, we will have a better perspective of constraint hierarchies as well as view relationships. So let's head to Xcode once again, shall we? Right, and as in our previous lessons, we go to Xcode, open a new project, a single view application. We will call it CareerMate, the language will be Swift, and the device, the iPhone. Let's click on Next. We create this project, and now go to the navigation window, the main storyboard. Highlight the View Controller Scene section, go to the File Inspector, and highlight Size Classes, and disable Size Classes, keeping it just for the iPhone. Right, so now it's time for us to drop our subviews onto the canvas. So we'll search for a view in the object library and drag and drop one here. And stretch things a bit so that it occupies 1/4 of the container, roughly. And stretch it again a bit. And now let's create a duplicate of this view. So I create a duplicate out here. That's the second subview. And we create a third and a fourth. And place all these views at the 4 corners of the container. And now we go to the first subview and we'll change its background color, make this red, and the others blue, green, and finally yellow out here. And as you can see in the document editor, these 4 views are components of the super view. So let's go to the first view out here and add some constraints. So first we'll pin this to the top left of the container, and similarly the blue one to the top right of the container, removing the constraints to margin option, and the green one we'll pin it to the bottom left, and finally the yellow one to the bottom right. So this is our first set of constraints, but we also have to make all these subviews of equal width and height. So let's do that by selecting all of them and going to the pin option again and selecting both equal widths and equal height. So you have 6 pairs of constraints. So I would like you to please check these constraints if you're not very clear. And finally a horizontal spacing between the red and blue view and a vertical spacing between the red and green view. And let's quickly check that the spacing should be 0. So I'll identify these 2 constraints. So this one is definitely not 0, so let's change it. And we go here and change things. So one question that you might have at this point is, why did I not add these horizontal and vertical spacings between the other views? And that's something I hope you would know the answer to. So now let's quickly go ahead and preview things. So this is how things look for the iPhone 6 in portrait mode, and this is how things look in the landscape mode. So I'm quite happy with the way things are turning out so far. So let's go ahead. All right. Now before we proceed, let's improve the readability of this section out here. So as you can see, there are too many views out here. It does not make sense because we do not know which view the constraint is talking about. So what we'll do is we will go to each view and go to the identity inspector, I think that's what it's called, and change this label here to reflect the view it is related to. So that's red, that's blue. Let's go and change this to green. And finally this one to yellow. So as you can see, the readability of this constraints section has improved drastically. And now let's continue by adding elements to our subviews. So I'll start by adding an image view onto this red subview and tweaking things a bit, and also add a label onto which the career title will go. So now let's quickly change the dimensions of this image view. I'm just going to stretch it to the margins and also pull it down a bit, and similarly move the label down. So that looks fine. And now before doing anything else, that is before adding any constraints, I'm going to set the image into this image view, and similarly add a text for the label. So this is an artist. Right, now we are ready to add some constraints. So we highlight this image view, and the important thing to note is the constraints are relative to which entity. Now that's important at this point. So let's pin this image view to the corners of the red subview. So we add 3 constraints here. And it's also very important to note where these constraints appear. So as you can see, these constraints are with respect to the red subview. So they appear under the red subview, and as compared to the other constraints that we have been seeing relative to the main subview. Right, so now let's take this artist text field and create a vertical spacing between it and the image view, and similarly create a spacing between it and the red subview. So that's a bottom spacing. And also keep this artist label in the center of the container. And we do not need to do that for the image view since we have already pinned it to the corners. So we have some errors out here, and we have our familiar content priority ambiguity error. So of course this has something to do with content hugging and compression resistance. So let's first highlight this image view and go to the class inspector and look at the vertical hugging priority and compression resistant priority. So it's 251 and 750. So let's check the values for the label, and that's the same. So that's where the ambiguity comes in, because if the dimensions of the view change vertically, so which element is to increase in size or decrease in size. So let's tweak the dimensions of our image. So basically, whenever needed, the image will increase or stretch, and similarly compress. So for that, we need to change the dimensions of the vertical content hugging and the vertical content compression resistance. And the hugging priority, of course, will be lower than that of the label, which will enable this element to stretch. And similarly, the compression resistance priority will also be lower, which means it has lesser resistance to compress. So please pause here for a moment and make sure that you have understood these concepts properly. And now, of course, the errors disappear, and let us fix this mismanagement. And we have no errors at this point in time. So now let's quickly go and preview things. So this is how our app looks like in the portrait mode, and this is how it looks like in the landscape mode. So as you can see, this artist has stretched quite a bit. Not very happy with it really. So let's see if we can do better in our next subview. Right, so this time we add an image view onto our blue subview, and as before, we try to get it into place, stretching it in all directions. And we'll just copy and paste this label out here and change its value. So we go to the image view, and this time let's add a superhero. Everyone wants to be a superhero. All right, so that's our superhero here. And let's change the label to reflect the same. We'll call it hero. And this time we're going to do something different. First, of course, we'll put our hero in the middle of the container, and similarly for the label, middle of the container. And this time we'll go to our hero and create a constraint between the image view and the blue subview, and we created an equal width constraint. Now you might find that a bit confusing at first, but let's go back to this section out here. And as you can see, you can add relational operators. So we'll say our hero width is less than or equal to 0.75 the width of its superview, which is the blue view. Okay, so that's just stop here and make sure this sinks in. So basically they are not of the same width, but it is less than or equal to 3/4 the size of its blue superview. And now let's go and create a vertical spacing out here. And as you can see, I want them to be in the same plane. So I'm just going to see that I've got 19 here and 18 in the previous section. So let's just change things. So let's go and make this 18 out here. And also please note that these constraints are created under the blue superview. Okay, and it's important to note, because if everything is, let's say everything is condensed, you might miss out these constraints which are under individual subviews. So make sure that you expand this section so that you can see all constraints. And now let's go back to this label out here and create a bottom space to container. And also I think I'm missing one more constraint. So let's go here to this hero image view and create a top space to container out here. And the moment we do that, I think we'll have our familiar error, which is a content priority ambiguity, and we know how to fix that. So let's quickly go to the image view out here and reduce its hugging priority. Let's make it 250, and similarly reduce its compression resistance priority. That's the vertical one, 749. The red text, goes away, and we can fix this mismanagement out here. Great. So now let's quickly preview things once again. And as you can see, the superhero is definitely thinner than our artist in the portrait mode, and similarly in the landscape mode. So which one do you prefer? That's quite a relative question. So I'll leave things here. And I would also like you to add in constraints and images and entities for the other two sections, and also play around with what we have learned so far and see if you can get things to look better. Thank you.